Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Laura Daly, and I, along with Charles Snyder, I'm co-chair of the Roundtable Committee, which is producing this event. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Just so you know, this event will be recorded and will be posted within 24 hours to the NAC's YouTube channel for you to watch again or share with your friends. And if you are interested in becoming a member of the National Arts Club, you can contact us at admissions@thenationalartsclub.org. I have put both links to the club and for admissions in the chat box for everyone to take a look. Today, we are joined by Carol Waller and Charles Nix of the Type Directors Club, who will discuss how typography drives culture and vice versa. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions that you might have. The Type Directors Club celebrates and amplifies the undeniable power of typography. The club is a global community united in the belief that type drives culture and culture drives type. The club is home for typography. Since 1946, its mission has been to educate, and they do that with speaking events, programs, scholarships, annual competitions, 8 exhibitions that are displayed around the world, and their annual book, The World's Best Typography. Our first speaker today is Carol Waller, who has been the Type Directors Club Executive Director since 1983. Ms. Waller is responsible for the day-to-day functioning of the club, including program coordination, especially the annual competitions. Additionally, Carol has become recognized as a lecturer bringing the history of the Type Directors Club to universities, schools, conferences around the globe, including in Dusseldorf, Paris, Brazil, Seoul, Shanghai, Taiwan. Ms. Waller has a type background from working in her family's business that spans a period of Ludlow typesetting in the 1950s through today's digital world. So thank you all for joining us. And I would now like to welcome Carol Waller.
Thank you very much, and I'm actually thrilled to be here. So as Laura had said, the Typography Club is a professional organization celebrating its 74th anniversary, and we are dedicated to educating its national membership and the graphic arts community about type design, and the myriad uses in the field of communications. It was announced yesterday that the Type Directors Club was merging into the One Club for Creativity. the TDC's devotion to culture-driving art forms so aligned with the designers and advertising creators in the One Club community made this joining of forces a perfect fit. As part of the One Club for Creativity, TDC will continue as an autonomous committee-based organization that maintains highly regarded the communication design and typeface design competitions, recognizing work from independent designers, agencies, and foundries. Ascenders competition honoring type-based portfolios of designers aged 35 and under, and the TDC medal recognizing individuals and institutions who have made outstanding contributions to the field of typography. The TDC does produce its annual The World's Best Typography, which showcases competitions winning works. Additionally, as Laura had said, displays in 8 traveling exhibitions to museums, schools, and design organizations globally. And the TDC does host and sponsors conferences, classes, workshops, exhibitions, type salons, and design job board, as well as scholarship programs, including the Beatrice Ward, Superscript, and TDC Scholarship for Deserving Students. Now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Charles Nix. He is a creative type director at Monotype. He's been with the company for 5 years, but has been designing type for 30 years. In fact, he's been around typography his entire life. His father was a printer, and he spent his formative years by his side at a press. He's chairman emeritus of the Type Directors Club and chaired the communication design program at Parsons. And in his spare time, he founded a publishing company where he was creative director since 2015, when he left to join Monotype. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Charles Nix.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Laura. Before I launch into a long screed about type and culture, can you all hear me? Because I'm about to go into presenter mode. And thank you. Thank you all via chat for saying yes, yes, yes. All right. I'm going to share my screen, so I'm going to lose track of you for a bit, but I hope you enjoy it. All right. Yell at me if you cannot see a giant red slide that says how type drives culture. All right, I'll assume that you can see it and that we're all following along. Thank you again for having me. I'd much rather be, as I'm sure the rest of you would, at the National Arts Club in New York City than, for me, stuffed in this tiny little studio. I remember the first time I was in this room, I was a lunch guest at the club as a lunch guest of John Haydick, who was then the dean of the architecture school at Cooper Union. And he was sending me to the club, not with him, but to thank me for having designed his letterhead and having done the architecture program posters for a couple of years. But I think in sending me here, he wanted to show me then, still a little boy from Ohio, a bit of what New York culture was. And I really loved it. It was so sort of foreign to me, having grown up in Ohio. It felt really sophisticated, sitting on a worn leather couch, which you can see over there on the left, sipping on a delicate little glass of sweet vermouth with a twist of lemon, and taking in the art and struggling to keep up with the conversation. It all seems like it was only yesterday, but it was 30 years ago, it was 3 decades ago. And given what I've been through and we've been through together in the past year, it seems maybe a decade longer. That's all by way of saying thank you to the National Arts Club for being the National Arts Club and for having me. And thank you to the Type Directors Club for being the Type Directors Club. And thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your day to hear me speak. Today, I'm going to speak about type pretty eventually and culture right away. And of course, as the title promises, I'll join those two together to talk a little bit about how type drives culture. And I'll start with culture, and I'll start right here with the Tower of Babel, which is a story I really love. The story, as you probably know, goes like this. Humans were of one language. They worked together very well, and buoyed by their skill and intelligence, they set to work building a tower to heaven. This angered their God, and he gathered together a host of angels to destroy the tower and to confuse their language. Unable to communicate, they ceased in making ambitious products or projects like the tower, and were scattered across the earth. So, one language, big tower. God finds them too ambitious. He breaks their tower. He confuses their language. It's a really strong meme or memes. So you get this warning about ambition, which is a very strong meme that shows up over and over again throughout human history. and you get the confusion of language and the birth of disparate cultures. Now, when I say meme, I'm not talking about funny photos with captions in all caps. What I'm talking about is something more like what Richard Dawkins was describing in the 1970s. It's an idea, a transfer of culture. It doesn't have to be true. There are thousands of false memes pinging around social media right now, but it does establish itself in the mind of the host, which is you and me, and then it copies itself. Mimetics, the study of memes, is considered by many to be a pseudoscience. Even Dawkins, who coined the phrase mimetics or memes, distanced himself from it. But the transfer of culture does happen. A meme is like a gene. The strong ones survive. The meme of the Tower of Babel is sort of a meta meme. It's a meme that describes the birth of cultures. So how strong is the confusion of languages as an idea, as a meme? Well, it shows up with the ancient Greeks when Hermes brings diversity of speech and sows the seeds of discord. Disparate cultures come to the Naga of Assam in India when three brothers who are making a little game of catching a rat are suddenly unable to communicate with one another, and each leaves to form his own Naga tribe. The Maidu, who are an indigenous tribe in what is now California, were struck by the confusion of languages on a feast day. Couples could understand each other, man and wife, but not other couples, which sounds sort of like a bad dinner party. In Guatemala, cold and famine brought the confusion of languages to the Quichumaya. In Polynesia, the people of the island of Hao were busy building, which angered their god, who destroyed their building and confused their language. Back in North America, a flood scattered the Casca people from their homes and confused their language. On the Australian continent, the Gunwinga, a people who were visited by a goddess while sleeping, were each given a different language by the goddess. On the same continent, the inhabitants of what is now Encounter Bay were beset with confused languages. They had been feasting on different parts of a recently deceased and particularly disagreeable woman. Each body part had its own language. And famine again caused the Wasania people of Kenya to be struck with language-confounding madness. So it's easy to interpret this confusion as a fall from a perfect state. And that's the way I think I've thought of it in the past. But the destruction of a unified language in each of these stories is also the destruction of monoculture. Each of these stories describes the birth of multiculturalism, the birth of new cultures, the birth of art and art forms. It's the birth of new oral traditions and literature. And it's all preserved through language, through writing, and now through type. That type preserves ideas is a very old notion of typography, but it is still true. We use type to record written language and to preserve ideas. Consider for a second the Fan Street Foundry, located unironically on Fan Street in London for nearly all of the 19th century. This is a page from their catalog, the selections from the specimen book of the Fan Street Foundry. It's sort of a greatest hits of their work from the first 70 plus years. In the case of this book, the idea being preserved by the type is the idea of the type itself. So what we're asked to look at or to look past are the words, or rather to see only the impression of the type, to see the container, the sort of capsule that holds ideas. And that capsule is the idea. And this fellow is Thomas Robert Malthus, the Reverend Thomas Malthus. He was a scholar and economist who lived in England from 1766 to 1834. He was, and he continues to be, a much debated writer, a sort of hero or punching bag, depending on which side of politics you are on or which decade you live. Malthus wrote a hugely influential essay called The Principle of Population. The 6th edition, which I'm showing you here, was published in 1826 and was set in the English modern style types from the Fan Street Foundry. The title page and its layout are spare and cheery. The first edition, published in 1798, was a bit more old-fashioned. It's set in transitional types, something between old style and modern. It's slightly warmer and more welcoming than the 6th edition. But despite the typography of both of these editions, the principles of population, the subject matter of it, rather, itself is not so cheery. Malthus was pondering the problem that food production is a slow, linear progression, while population growth is an exponential curve, getting steeper with every generation. And the point at which these two lines cross over is a catastrophe. It's a Malthusian catastrophe. It's the onset of famine and disease. This theory took on a life of its own with widespread readership, discussion, adoption, and repercussions way beyond what Malthus had originally envisioned. So if you're looking for a fun vacation read, don't take Principles of Population. It's not fun. This man did read it for fun. This is, of course, Charles Darwin, who needs probably no introduction. Darwin began reading the 6th edition of Malthus' Principle of Population, the one set in the Fan Street types, for fun, in September of 1838, which was 4 years after Malthus's death. And he began to think about how he could apply this idea to the animal world, that is, the non-human animal world. 21 years later, The Origin of the Species was published. Darwin had transformed the Malthusian catastrophe into the theory of natural selection, and he changed culture forever. But notice that it was the English modern types of the Fan Street Foundry that preserved the ideas of Malthus for Darwin, and it was the Fan Street types that allowed Darwin's theory to be preserved and spread all around the world, and then to fundamentally change the way that we think about where we come from and how we evolved. Something or some things triggered Malthus to think about the ramifications of population growth. The ideas surrounding it pinged back and forth in his brain, sort of quite literally, like little electric impulses tossed back and forth between his synapses, like a sort of game of hot potato. Those thoughts evolved into cogent ideas that he then wrote down to share with others. And then those words, set into type, were replicated and distributed. If all of this sounds vaguely like a virus, it's because culture spreads like a virus. The strong ideas, at least the long, live at least long enough to evolve, and the strongest replicate themselves in a million ways. Cultural movements are like outbreaks. Some of them are beneficial and constructive, amalgamations that move us forward, and some of them are diseases, destructive forces that dull our humanity. Fan Street type helped put Malthus's ideas into the heads of others, where they again pinged back and forth. And in the case of Darwin, the ideas evolved, and the cycle started again. Culture lives in ideas. Culture lives in the product of those ideas. But back to the Fan Street types. Consider their role as one of the ways that type drives culture. And consider the specimen again. Consider that the type is culture. The design of type is an idea unto itself. It's the key point in the evolution of an alphabet. Starting with the Roman capitals, like these much revered and much copied capitals from the base of Trajan's column, in Trajan's Forum, in Rome, carved around 113 AD. These are very formal letters that were written with a brush and later carved into stone to create a permanent impression. The Roman capitals lived alongside of this running script. It's a very informal, everyday handwriting. These little thin wooden tablets are kind of miraculous survivors from the Roman fort at Vindolanda in Britain. They were written about 100 years after the Trajan inscription was carved, and they're notes. Unlike the inscriptional capitals, which were meant to last forever, these weren't meant to last at all. This grouping of 4 composes a note from one soldier to another about supplies for the fort. The Roman capitals and running script evolved into the uncial and half uncial in the Middle Ages, as in this fragment from the 4th century. Various factors, obvious and not so obvious, led to the decline of writing and reading in the Roman Empire. And in the 3rd to 7th centuries, things really went a little bit south. But around the 8th century, a revival of learning started under Charlemagne, Charles I. Part of that revival of reading and writing involved the regularization of writing under the guidance of Alcuin of York and the European monasteries. The revival script is the Carolingian minuscule, accompanied by, in this example, from the 8th century, square capitals. This style is a descendant and an improvement of the styles that came before it. It's remarkable and influential because of both the quantity of writing done under Charlemagne and the consistency of the style. It was the Carolingian calligraphy that the humanist scholars looked to in the Italian Renaissance. In the 14th century, Petrarch began collecting and copying all the Greek and Roman manuscripts he could get his hands on. He looked to revive and preserve both the form and the content of Europe's cultural past. He referred to the missing years between Charlemagne and the 1400s as the Dark Ages, and it sort of stuck. His associate, Coluccio Sulatari, was born in the 15th century, and he was a scholar and collector who amassed a library of 800 ancient books. Niccolo de Niccoli was also a scholar and had a fine running hand, an italic handwriting that prefigured early italic typefaces. Poggio Braccolini, a revered scholar and preserver of manuscripts, was in part responsible for reviving the Carolingian, developing it into a style we now call the humanist. Vespasiano de Besticci, a successful bookseller, was responsible for commissioning classics from calligraphers and forming many great libraries during the Italian Renaissance. Together, these 5, along with other humanist collectors and scribes, set the model for what would become the earliest Roman typefaces. Those early Roman types, what we now call Venetian old styles, included masterful fonts from Nicholas Jensen, and Jensen's fonts informed the old style letters of Garamond and Grandjean in the 16th century. And in the mid-18th century, John Baskerville evolved the form of type further through his transitional types, which was sort of a step between the old style types and the modern types of Bedoni and Dido, or rather the Didos. We called these abstracted letters of Bedoni and Dido modern, because they exhibit a distinct break with the handwriting as a model for type design. They are modern as type because they are abstract. And back again to the English expression of the modern type in the Fan Street Foundry types. In each instance, from Jensen on, Western type evolved. It's by no means a direct lineage. The form of type, a culture of its own, had many unique branches. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have brought, we as type designers have brought a fantastic sort of Tower of Babel type design moment. A new confusion of the language of type, with new cultures happening nearly every day in a conversation between form and content, between high culture and low culture, between East, West, North, and South, between your culture and my culture, between then culture and now culture. Consider this man, Paul Renner, who set out against the backdrop of Bauhaus-infused culture in 1924 to create a new type. A practiced book designer and design professor, he wanted to make a type informed by geometry, but classically legible, a form that spoke for the 1920s and for the future of design. The result was Futura. It was for a couple of years in development after the designs were actually completed. In 1927, the Bauer Type Foundry released Futura in 2 weights, light and medium. And even with this limited palette, the typeface became an immediate success, having perfectly captured the zeitgeist. Futura bold arrived in 1928. Light oblique, medium oblique, semi-bold, semi-bold oblique, semi-bold condensed, and bold condensed came around in 1930. Futura book came in 1932. Futura bold oblique didn't arrive until 37. And book oblique arrived in 39. Light condensed had to wait until after World War II, arriving in 1950. And in 1954, Futura kräftig was added, which was a sort of semi-bold. Extra bold came in 52, and extra bold oblique in 1955. That's 28 years in the making of the Futura family. Futura defined modern typography, not modern typography like Bodoni and Dido or the Fan Street types, but the typographic form that was associated with modernism in the 20th century. It was used as a cultural signifier, lending modern flair to everything from fashion magazines to children's books, to Detroit autos to tiny little German autos. And it created a minor kerfuffle in 1929 when art director Mehmed Fehmi Acha chose to use it as the typeface for Vanity Fair. Now, it wasn't so much Futura's fault as the wholehearted embrace of the new typography. The new typography was a revolutionary approach to typography championed by Paul Renner's colleague Jan Tschichold in the 1928 book, The New Typography. In the new typography, Tschichold had advocated for all lowercase settings of type, which was a revolutionary concept that was all the more revolutionary and somewhat more sensible in Germany, where all nouns are capitalized. The experiment at Vanity Fair lasted for 3 months, when the editors announced in the magazine in March of 1930 that it was over. After the change back, the New York Times cheekily proclaimed that Vanity Fair had once again embraced capitalism. Such a bad joke. Another Condé Nast publication, Mademoiselle, which is the magazine for the smart young woman, had flirted with sans serif types on the cover in the 1950s, here in the middle with News Gothic, but retreated to lively, fashion-friendly, modern serif fonts. However, in the mid-60s, Futura made an inroads at this Condé Nast publication also. It appeared in a supporting role in the cover for April, July, and August of 1965. And it was back again in December of 1966 and back again in August of 1968. Futura never really stuck, but I will point out, and I'll stress and stress again, that this is purely a coincidence, that during this period of a few years, a young designer named Barbara Kruger began working at Mademoiselle. She had left college at Parsons School of Design to take an entry-level role at the magazine. She was quickly promoted and lit off on a decade-long graphic design career, working on various Condé Nast publications while simultaneously making art. In 1976, she moved to California to teach at Berkeley. In 1977, she took up photography. And in 1979, she began combining images and typography to make what has become her signature style: found images and Futura bold oblique. Usually white type on a red rectangle, usually black and white photographic images, always Futura. In 1994, 13 years after Barbara Kruger co-opted Futura as a design trope and made it her own, skate culture turned collector brand Supreme set up shop. The irony was pretty rich that Kruger style, which was developed as a cultural commentary, was now being capitalized on, literally and figuratively, for its art scene cultural cachet. It was lending street cred to a startup skate brand. The irony got very rich about 20 years later when Supreme, now an internationally successful company, sued streetwear brand Married to the Mob for $10 million. Why? Well, ostensibly the word Supreme and Futura bold oblique in a rectangle. And to continue the saga, in 2017, Barbara Kruger debuted / dropped / performed 5 new works as part of the Performa 17 biennial. In one of the 5, titled Untitled, The Drop. It was a pop skate-up fashion shop in Soho, where art fans could wait on a long line to purchase skateboards, t-shirts, and a beanie, stitched in Futura, saying, "Want it, buy it, forget it." That should have been the last word, but last night I went to the park and my friend was wearing this shirt, so I had to take it. I'll take a picture of it and include it. It makes the supreme bitch meme all the more absurd. But Futura itself gets the last word in this story. Last week, a new chapter was written in the Futura story with the release of Futura Now by Monotype. The entire family was redesigned, and the 28-year weight and style development was retailored into a cohesive design system of 102 different fonts, including, importantly, redesigned obliques, including Futura Bold Oblique. Like Futura, when Helvetica arrived in 1957, it became a sort of cultural force. In the first few years, it was really exclusive. That, coupled with its clarity, simplicity, and neutrality, made it a favorite among the emerging international style. Helvetica's success and cultural omnipresence helped it graduate. It graduated down into the culture through transfer lettering and decals. It became the background noise for government forms, and it acquired a sort of corporate augustness, signifying the version of whatever it was applied to. So the airline, the train, the cola, the department store, the rugged vehicle, the electronics company. Electronics company is such a quaint phrase now. The whatever these guys do. The pharmaceutical company, and again, whatever these guys do. Helvetica eventually became a pop culture. Experimental jet set made Helvetica into a meme. And to cement its icon status, Gary Hustwit gave Helvetica its own video. And again, just this past week in Helvetica news, Monotype and Miltog launched a collab collection of Helvetica cycling gear. Type is the culture. I'll end the tour of type as culture with a short tribute to a recurring type leitmotif of the last 100 years. In 1922, Oswald Bruce Cooper designed Cooper Black as the ultra-bold companion to his Cooper Old Style family. By 1927, it had lit the advertising world on fire. Practically any magazine from that time will have at least one Cooper Black ad in the back of it. It spawned imitations, like Goudy Heavyface, but as we've seen with other type cultural stories, imitation is a relative term. Sure, Goudy Heavyface is like Cooper Black, but then Goudy was one of Cooper's teachers. And though Cooper Black has set a trend in type, it was already a trend for a couple of decades in lettering for advertising design. Will Bradley had been hand lettering titles at the turn of the century. He was part of the American expression of the arts and crafts movement. These pieces, from 1896 and 1905 respectively, are lettering. They're not typefaces. As is this display lettering for the Roycrofters from a 1900 title page by Elmer Adler. But this soft, old style of lettering eventually found typographic expression. In fonts like Bookman from 1903, Cheltenham from 1903 also, Souvenir from 1914, and later, yes, Cooper Black and Goudy Heavyface. And the first 2 decades of the 20th century also saw the rise of pictorial modernism and its wonder boy, Lucien Bernhard. His style prefigures Cooper Black by at least a decade, and he was also contracted to design fonts, including his first, Bernhard Antiqua, in 1912. But back to Cooper Black. It never really went away, but it lacked the seriousness to sort of play in the next decade, to make any kind of starring role in World War II propaganda. And in the 1950s, advertising had moved on to hand lettering-infused optimism, fueled by a steady flow of vibrant, large headlines from Madison Avenue bullpens. But the 1960s saw a mini countercultural revival of Cooper Black, particularly around music. Major and minor acts were dipping into Cooper Black's friendliness and everyman approachability. Frank Zappa, Simon and Garfunkel, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, and even Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie took advantage of Cooper Black. By the 1970s, Cooper Black was a cultural force again, showing up everywhere from logos for down-home clothiers to dominant burger chains. But a decade later, in the 1980s, Cooper Black was a sort of persona non grata again, associated with a sort of goofy, less sophisticated time. With the rise of deconstructivism and the mining of the vernacular styles in the 1990s, Cooper Black found a new sophistication. The seeds for the rise of the vernacular in design were planted by Pete Schroeders in his 1977 essay, Lay In and Lay Out. The 20th anniversary reprint features Cooper Black highlight on the cover. The vernacular in graphic design and typography reinserts overt messages in the form of type, the design of type, that modernism sought to background through faces like Accidens Grotesque, Futura, Helvetica, and Univers. By the early aughts, Cooper Black's 7+ decades of ubiquity, including its preponderance in everyday signage and low-budget packaging, made it an ironic go-to. The last typeface that you'd want to use became an ironic first choice. And now, this very day, Cooper Black is appreciated. Type designers and type users appreciate the deftness of its construction, its ability to pack in so much weight and so much warmth. It's a counterpoint to all the neutral sans serifs in the branding landscape. It is now, nearly 100 years later, a classic. Still a little bit ironic, but increasingly taken at face value. Admired for the impression that it makes. Face value is an apropos expression. It's the value of the face of type impressed into paper, that I'd like to end on. The impression of type. Woodblock printing in the East and West gave us the impression. Images and text were pressed into paper. The impression of early movable type in the East and West was more impressive. Its movability, its reusability, its combinability made it possible to print more and to impress more people. Type in the West, printing from movable type and later mechanized typesetting, was measured in impressions. Printing presses still measure the number of impressions now, even though the ink sits on the surface. Advertisers began measuring impressions as a means of touting the success of ad placements, often inflating the numbers by multiples to account for the idea that more than one person would see an ad and would be impressed. And when advertising and promotion, especially in this year of digital transformation, migrated to the screen, we still speak of impressions. It's the impression of type, the ability of type to impress on its own and to amplify a message. It's that ability that helps type drive culture. And it's because type itself is remarkable that type is culture. Thank you. I will stop sharing now.
Thank you, Charles. That was really, really fabulous. I do have some questions, so let me get to those. From Paul Smith, he says, on my desk, I notice a book by Bemby printed in Latin in 1556. How would he determine what typeface being used?
I mean, that will be that 1556 is relatively early, so the number of printers is still limited. So it will show up in a catalog of books early printing. The title itself will sort of get you there. But at that period, often the final charge in the book, the sort of last page, the colophon, which is named after the colophon. Well, I was about to tell an apocryphal story and claim it as truth. Anyway, the colophon will often tell the origin of the type in the printer. But I would say probably dollars to donuts, as we used to say in Ohio, that that book probably is in a catalog online.
Uh-huh. Okay, so thank you. Our next question is from Brendan Cunningham. And Brendan asks, did non-Romantic languages, such as Russian and Asian languages, forge their own way on typeface, or did they also seem to follow similar patterns, such as Futura, Helvetica, etc.?
Well, I lean on the for my knowledge of the evolution of Cyrillic, for instance, and for every other typeface that is not my native script. I lean on experts, and at Monotype we have a lot of them. But for Cyrillic, I think of Maxim Zhukov, and I took a workshop with him at the Type Directors Club, and it was striking to realize that how synthetic Cyrillic was. That it sort of arrived as a new script as a result of a decree, not so much as sort of the evolution of evolution of forms in the way that the Roman alphabet had, or even Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And so it sort of begins its life as a modern, it begins its life not only during the modern period at the beginning of the 19th century, but it begins its life as a modern typeface. High contrast between thick and thin, serifs that have no brackets, so no little tapers between the stem and the serif. Generally large X height. Well, in the case of Cyrillic, the X height is yeah, I mean, it is what it is. But it then has to find its way back if it's going to appear as an old style. So it's almost it has a synthetic stylistic move backwards and forwards. So I mean, all by way of saying they're all different. I mean, there are ancient traditions that far predate the development of Latin as a script for other languages. I mean, movable type in the East was around for, I don't know how many years before it arrived in the West, but not decades, more like centuries. I want to say it was 3,000 years, but that's impossible. I think it was 300 years. Sorry, that was the worst answer that a non-scholar could give.
Well, thanks for the effort. The next question is, can you elaborate on how digital exposure to type as compared to the physical encounter, with a book, affects the viewer experience of both the type and the content?
I can comment on I can only anecdotally comment on it. I mean, I can tell you at the end of this day, having been on Zoom meetings from the first moment I got up and sat down in this chair until now, and probably one more after this, I will crawl out of this studio to a printed book just to give my eyes a rest, and then sit down at the table with the print edition of the New York Times and read through through probably the front section again, just to sort of to inform myself, but to rest my eyes. Mm-hmm. I think it's probably a different question for me in the time that I grew up in, and sort of transitional from strictly print as a child to strictly digital as a full-grown adult. I would answer this very differently than my son, who's been in a digital world since the day he was born. And it also depends on what it is that you're reading. Like long form text, and I tend to bore people with this. I'm sorry, but not all text is text. I mean, there are things that are telegraphic, like what we read in the newspaper. Then there are things that require more investment in terms of time and mental energy that we prefer to see in books. And the line lengths associated with those, and the typefaces associated with those, and the time spans that we spend comprehending them are all different. And so we sort of have to think of each of them as their own thing. And I'm not trying to sort of wiggle my way out of answering it, but physically, you need more letter spacing in digital type, generally speaking, just because of halation. And halation is the glow around letter forms. You need to generally have letters for text that have larger X heights, so that the meaty portion of the letter, the area between the waistline or the top of the lowercase x and the baseline is larger. You need to make sure that there's a large enough point size for you to actually read. I mean, I can go through the 13 things that are necessary to achieve great legibility on screen, but there are great parallels with what you need to be legible in print. There's just slightly different things for screen that have much more to do with the way that we look at type when we're driving down the highway than they do with the way that we look at type when we're reading a book.
Another question from Catherine. What is the most popular font today?
Oh, today? This week?
Yeah.
It's Futura now. It's at the top of the linotype list. It's at the top of the monotype list. It's at the top of the My Fonts list, both bestsellers and hot new fonts. It's dominating this week. Of all time, I don't know. It tends to, I mean, Helvetica is very popular. It's ubiquitous. It's useful. It's omnipresent. But yeah, this week it's Futura.
What is your favorite?
This week, it's Cooper Black. But no, generally when I answer that question, I say it's the typeface that I designed last, which is Ambiguity. So Ambiguity is still my favorite typeface because it's something that I believe in as an idea, and I spent a lot of time making, and it's something for me that was not not a revival, not a cover. It was an idea sort of born out of culture, actually.
That leads to another question. What is the process of creating a typeface? So how did Ambiguity come to life?
So there was a time when I used to ride the subway every day. And I think there's nothing sadder in the world than an artist or designer in transit without a pencil and paper. So I carry a sketchbook, and I sketch whenever I get a free moment, or write. And I had been at a conference in Toronto, and I heard a number of keynote speakers, and Paola Antonetti from the Museum of Modern Art gave a interesting sort of tour of current trends in her collecting and curatorial look at the world. And one of the things that she posited was that there was this idea that we could have utopia right now if we just shifted our idea of what utopia was, by embracing those moments between the things that we hold as perfect, the things that fall between the cracks or that blend. And if we were able to stop thinking of utopia as this sort of unattainable ideal, that it was well within our grasp if we thought of ambiguity, for instance, as an ideal. And I took it I've found it moving, especially in the examples that she gave, and she's a very great public speaker, so she's very convincing. But then I started to think in my own typographic work, what are the things that that I hold sacred? And one of them is that slide that I showed you of the Trajan inscription, which is its proportions, not just I hold to be sort of perfect in some way, but that have informed so much of the shape and form of Roman capitals in typefaces for the last 500 years. And I thought, how could I break those? Like, just destroy your idols as an exercise. And so I thought back to those proportions and the lessons of calligraphy at Cooper Union with Don Koons. And there was a giant photograph in that calligraphy room at Cooper of the Trajan inscription. I remember looking at them and, reading Edward Kadich and all of the other sort of appreciations of the Trajan inscription and the sort of limited number of proportions that were involved in it. And so I started messing with the proportions, and that led to more sort of flipping of proportions. And all by way of saying, the idea came from a lecture, but it went on a detour and sort of expressed itself one morning while I was riding the subway. And when I got to that moment, I thought, I could play with this and I could make something that disturbs me, but that I could grapple with as an intellectual exercise. And so that's where I went.
Do you have a sample of it?
I do. I think I could change my background here and you get the capitals at least. Hold on a second.
Yay.
It's you can see the 3 different states of it. So what I did was, one second. This is like bad radio. I have to find the window. Oh boy. But yeah, there are 3 different states. So there's one very sort of classic state, and then there's a radical state that sort of flips the proportions from what you would want them to be. Let's see if it works for me. All right, now it's behind me. I made fake fake pegboard of it. So yeah, you can see in this C, for instance, in the second row, that there's the standard Trajan proportion. And then if you flip it and sort of say, okay, what if I made the C condensed? You would get this radical proportion. And then the one after that is something I call normate, which goes back to something my mother used to say in the 70s. I had a developmentally disabled sister, I still do. And my mom would call everyone normates because the quote unquote normal people referred to developmentally disabled people as retardates, which she found just horribly offensive. And so I called this this version of the typeface normate, sort of a dig at all normal people, because it's an impossible sort of synthetic state that exists as a combination of radical and traditional being blended together. That's
great.
what it looks like.
That's great. Lots of questions. Okay. In professional resumes and cover letters, do you think the type one uses says something about the individual?
Well, sure. I mean, the form and the content are inextricable. But right before this, I was in a panel discussion, like immediately before this, and we were talking about the sort of change that's taken place over the last 9 months and how difficult it's been to maintain brand consistency as you're suddenly in 50 different digital channels at the same time. How do you make that voice sort of come? And typography is one of the ways, of course, that you can make that voice consistent. But the form and the content are sort of inextricable from one another. what I find in this sort of digital transformation that is as important as the form, though, because I'm sort of obviously obsessed with typography, so that's where I live, is in the form of the type. But I'm in love with carefully chosen words. And I think that what the sort of varieties of expression require of us, the sort of varieties of brand expression require of us, is to be very careful about the words that we choose and to even test words. Like a comedian would test material in front of a live audience. Like you need to make sure that the words that you choose are really good. So I'm getting back to the point, which is that it's not so much the type that you choose for your resume, but what it says and how you say it, both in terms of how the type is used. Is it too big? Is it too small? Is it flush left or rag right? Is it centered? But what does it say? Are you using consistent hierarchies in terms of the expression of information? So do you always use gerunds? Or do you always just start with an adjective or a noun? But whatever you do it consistently. And that sort of, that means that the typeface, the substrate, the color, all of it is sort of helping reinforce the core message, which is that this person is worth hiring. But personally, I would go as straightforward as possible.
Next question is, do you have any book recommendations for anyone who's interested in learning more about typography and the history of it?
That's hilarious. I would think that this is a plant, because I do have 100 different books that that a long time ago I put together, and I need to update it, but it's still a fine starting place. But it's 100 books on type, with links to Amazon where you can buy them. And I think the links benefit the Type Directors Club, maybe still. At any rate, it's on the TDC website, sources or resources. I'm going to have to look it up. But maybe I don't want to sort of get off of this call and not having given the exact address for this. I think I've got it. One second. There we go. I'm going to paste it into the
Put it into the chat.
Right now.
Great, thanks.
That just happened in real time. An old person got you a helpful link. So yeah, there it is. And again, right now I think it's in alphabetical order. I don't know.
Most recent, so people will just have to go to the bottom of the chat box and they'll see it.
Oh yeah. But my the book list is in some sort of random order. I did another version where I put it in order of like, you must read these ones first, but there you go.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I could add that properly formatted list to the comments on the YouTube channel tomorrow.
Okay.
That would be a nice thing for me to do.
Thanks. That's excellent. Let's see. We have time for one or two more questions. Okay. What advice would you give a student interested in the field of designing and studying typefaces?
Well, it's funny that when I was a little kid, there were people, like my three sort of most important influences as an undergrad: Don Koons, who taught me calligraphy, William Bevington, who gave me a sort of enthusiasm for typography, and George Sadek, who really taught me a lot about the fine details of working with type as a typographer, but as a type user. When it came that moment, that sort of weird moment in 1989, 90, actually probably 88, 89, 90, and I wanted to design my own typefaces, it was like tumbleweeds and crickets. Like there was not much around for how it was done, or or who to talk to even. But within like 5 years, the entire world had changed, and there were not ready resources in terms of people to talk to, though I did find out later that they were there. Um, but most of what I learned in that 5-year period was like every other type designer I know of my age, were things that we taught ourselves, were books that we read, were people that we talked to, were, things that we sort of sourced out on our own. Now, however, life is so grand because there's a web and links like the one I put into the chat that sort of tell you like, here's like, don't go to the library and find these books. Like, here they are. These are the ones that have helped me develop. And they're typography programs. And typography I consider sort of a history, form, and use. Like, study the history of type, study what type looks like, its sort of physical attributes, and study how it's used. So, and there are programs for each of those things. Like, I mean, most good typography programs will teach you how to use type and a little bit about the history of type. And of course, the world is full of books about the history of type now. The form of type, making type, I mean, there are programs, some programs, mini programs in undergrad, and there are a host of postgraduate and mini programs, the chief among which in the United States right now is Type at Cooper. So if you want to learn how to design type, take one of the many flavors of Type at Cooper programs. But if you're in England, go to Reading. If you're in the Netherlands, go to The Hague, and it goes on.
Mhm. Okay, our last question is, where do you see typeface style going in the future?
Well, I mean, in the near future, I think we're at some sort of crazy inflection point right now, that 100 years from now we'll sort of look at and sort of say like, wow, that was the time in which that happened. But we've been sort of laboring under a PostScript and TrueType format for, I don't know, almost 3 decades, for maybe longer actually. And we now have a format on the horizon. I mean, it's available now. Futura now, which came out last week, is available as a variable font. And so variable fonts are fonts that include the entire family or some large portion of the family in a single font file. And they not only include the things that you're used to seeing, like bold, regular, light, all of those standard weights, but any weight in between. And if there's a width axis, you can get the widths in between, and optical sizes and, italics, all of them can be combined into a single font file. And then that font file, because it's all compact and it contains all the possibilities of those axes, it can be animated, among other things. And it can be much faster on the web because it's one call to a server that contains all of these styles. And for people like me who love to get just the perfect weight for text, it represents that possibility too, like something that's semi-light instead of light. So it's the possibility of type being responsive as a result of this new font format that I think is going to change type in the near future in a way that will make it very different from what it was for the past 30 years as digital. So I'm excited about that. In fact, you can hear me talk about variable type at Adobe Max next week.
All right, so this is absolutely fabulous. Charles, thank you so much. Carol, you too. It was just great. I have just added the website, the URL for the Type Directors Club, and anybody who's interested in type really should go. There's a lot of information and inspiration because there's so much wonderful stuff that's on that site.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Carol, and thank you everyone who tuned in to listen. It was, it's a pleasure for me, and an honor. So thanks again.
It was a wonderful presentation, just fabulous. To remind everybody, this will be on the National Arts Club YouTube channel as of tomorrow. So if you had any other questions, put them in the comments section, and we can somewhat keep this conversation going. So thanks to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck with the new affiliation with the Type Directors.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, okay. Goodbye, everybody.
So long.
Thanks.